So very warm welcome, everybody. So good to have so many of you here. This is great. I'm Jo Neal, Professor of Psychopharmacology at the University of Manchester. And of course, one of our speakers is from Manchester today. I'm Chair of Drug Sciences Medical Psychedelics Working Group, and I'm part of the Street Drugs Events team. And that's with James Morgan and Chris Chandler from London Metropolitan University. And James Morgan is here, but he's muted himself, turned his camera off at the moment because I'm hosting it. So these events, we've been running these for quite a while now, about a year and a half, and they are in collaboration with Drug Science. So, and Alex for Drug Science is in charge of the tech. So it's just a reminder about Drug Science. It's the UK's leading independent organisation providing evidence-based information about drugs. We also do research, and of course they're providing access to medical cannabis through their amazing project 2021. We've got 3 working groups. I chair the medical psychedelics. We also have medical cannabis working group and drug consumption rooms. So there's an awful lot going on at Drug Science. But this is a street drugs event. So this is our 11th virtual street drugs event. And these evolved in the pandemic from live events. So we started out in Manchester, then we went to London, and then we went to Cardiff. So we've had 3 live events. And of course, hopefully next year we'll be able to do another live event, all focusing around drug policy, drug law reform, and the science of currently illegal drugs, and some legal drugs as well, alcohol and so on, nicotine. But for the Zoom events, we started in 2020 in the pandemic. We started with a discussion on drug policy and sort of examining what an effective drug policy would look like. And interestingly, what I find is universities do not have a particularly health and harm reduction approach to drug use with their students, in their student population and in their staff, actually. So many of us are working to change that support for students and staff. So that was the first one. And then we moved on to chemsex, then psychedelic medicine, and that was a year ago, almost to the day today. E-cigarettes, cannabis, alcohol, stimulants, policing and politics, drug consumption rooms, and the last one, I don't know if many of you were at that, was on the future of festivals. But today we're looking at SPICE, the synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonist. And we have 2 absolutely brilliant and very, very knowledgeable speakers for you today, folks. Oh, just one thing, this event will be recorded. So don't panic if you have to leave, you'll be able to catch up on this, and that'll be posted on James Morgan's YouTube channel and also on the Drug Science website. And it'll probably be posted, I don't know, maybe end of next week, beginning of the week after. So just, patience while we get it all sorted. Okay, so that's pretty much it from me for now. It gives me huge pleasure, and I'm very grateful to you 2 for doing this, so thank you very much. To introduce our first speaker, Dr. Caitlin Norman. So she has recently completed her PhD in forensic drug chemistry at the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee. So she's quite a long way north today, joining us. And her focus is the detection of synthetic cannabinoids in prisons. She's now a postdoc, successfully defended her thesis very recently. She's a postdoc in forensic drug analysis in prisons at the Leverhulme Research Centre. And this is working in very close collaboration with the Scottish Prison Service. Her work is focused on the analysis of seized non-judicial samples. And the aims of this project are to provide drugs intelligence, which of course is essential, and helping to reduce the use of new psychoactive substances in prisons, and thereby improving the safety and security of prisoners and staff within the prison system. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand you over to Caitlin. Thank you very much, Caitlin.
Thank you. I'll just share my slides. Everybody see it okay? So I'm going to be giving you kind of an overview of what spice, or as we would call them, synthetic cannabinoids are, and then their use within the prisons here in Scotland. So synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, or SCRAs, which are commonly known as spice, or K2 is often used in the United States, are drugs that are designed to mimic the effects of THC, which is the main psychoactive component of cannabis. These drugs are actually usually a crystalline, so a powder or an oil, but they're usually dissolved into a solvent like ethanol or acetone, and then sprayed onto plant material and smoked similarly to cannabis. We like to stress that SCRAs are not synthetic cannabis. A lot of media and newspaper reports will talk about them as synthetic marijuana or synthetic cannabis, but that's really not true. SCRAs are full agonists of the cannabinoid or CB receptors, whereas THC is only a partial agonist. So if you think about the cannabinoid receptor as the lock and the ligand, so either THC or the SCRA as the key, THC is a bit more like trying to pick a lock with a hairpin. Like you can do it, it's going to take a little bit of time and it's not going to work that well. Whereas SCRAs are like the key that fits perfectly into the lock and will turn really easily. In addition, SCRAs have different and more severe adverse effects than THC. It's actually been found that SCRAs can have a 30 times higher risk of adverse effects requiring emergency treatment than cannabis. And some of these effects include cardiovascular effects, seizures, acute kidney injury, and suppression of breathing, as well as some adverse psychological effects like aggression, acute and chronic psychosis, self-harm and suicide, and addiction. And there's also been a number of deaths related to the use of these substances as well. Overall, these effects are actually more common of drugs such as like methamphetamine, psychostimulants, rather than cannabis. So SCRAs were actually originally synthesized for research starting in the 1940s and 1950s, and then research papers and patents documenting their synthesis and effects were published. The first SCRAs for recreational use were identified in 2008 in Germany, and after that, the number of new compounds emerging on the illicit market significantly increased. You can see in that bottom right-hand corner from the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drugs Addiction, or the EMCDDA. That's the number of new SCRAs notified to them each year. A lot of the emergence of new SCRAs can be related back to the enactment of legislation around the world, where producers and legislators kind of had a cat and mouse game, where the moment legislators would control one compound, producers would just slightly change the compound and release it to try and get around that legislation so it could still remain a legal high. Some of the most common ways that they would change these compounds would be, as in the top right corner, to fluorinate. So add a fluorine to that bottom tail, which actually also has the unintended consequence of making the compound 2 to 5 times more potent. Another common change is what we call scaffold hopping, or the addition or movement of nitrogens around the core of the compound. So there are a lot of SCRAs out there, and there's a lot of different names for them. So before I go forward and just start, firing names at you, I just want to explain what they mean a little bit. So a lot of the early research SCRAs were named after the person or organization who originally synthesized it. So JWH stands for John W. Huffman, CP stands for Charles Pfizer, and so on. When they were sold in head shops as legal highs, they were known under a variety of names, and that's where Spice and K2 came from. But there are also a lot of like crazier names like Scooby Snack and Banana Cream Nuke. We tend to use a more scientific naming system that's based on the 4 main structural components of SCRAs, the linked group, tail, core, and blinker. So since 2008, the UK has seen roughly 3 generations of SCRAs, which can be related back to the enactment of 3 changes to the UK Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, which is the main legislation in the UK for the control of drugs that might be abused. Over time, SCRAs actually became more and more potent, and now the SCRAs that are currently on the market can be up to 500 times more potent than THC. In 2016, the UK enacted the Psychoactive Substances Act, which made illegal the production, distribution, sale, and supply of any substance for human consumption that is psychoactive. It also made it illegal to possess them in prisons. This essentially stopped the open sale of straws. However, it also meant that the UK legislation really no longer has any impact on the market. And it's really only legislation in countries, mainly where they're produced, like China, that seems to have any impact on the market anymore. In August 2018, the Chinese government banned 5-FMDMB Pinaca and A and B Fubinaca, which were two of the most common straws on the market at the time. Following the enactment of the Psychoactive Substances Act, when they stopped being sold openly in head shops, the use is now mainly only seen in prisons and in rough sleeping populations. In Scotland, due to the really unique drug culture here involving mainly benzodiazepines and gabapentinoids, we really only see them in prisons, and there's really almost no use within the general population. Following this, the Psychoactive Substances Act, as you can see in the chart on the right there, the use of new psychoactive substances, or NPS, particularly straws, was found to increase inside the prisons and decrease outside the prisons. The use of straws in the Scottish prisons has led to increased aggression, violence, and medical emergencies. According to the Scottish Prison Service annual reports, there has been an increase in both prisoner-on-prisoner and prisoner-on-staff assaults over the last few years, with some of them said to be drug-related due to an increase in the number of people being managed under the influence of unknown substances, as well as an overall unpredictability of prisoners' behavior. Straws are typically infused into papers or other materials such as clothing and then mailed into the prisons. As of the end of December 2018, all Scottish prisons are smoke-free, but e-cigarettes are still allowed. This kind of had the unintended consequence of changing the way that straws are used within the prisons. Prior to the ban, a piece of paper would be rolled up into a cigarette and smoked. But after the ban, they now take approximately a 1 centimeter squared piece of paper and place it next to the heating element of the e-cigarette and then vape it. It's not really known how this changes the effects of these straws at this point. But we do still see some makeshift pipes like the pen and the milk bottle there at the bottom. So since 2018, we have collaborated with the Scottish Prison Service to have a near real-time laboratory-based program to detect non-judicial samples. And we have now been able to provide drugs intelligence information to the Scottish Prison Service, as well as the English and Wales Prison Service and other prison services around the world, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, EMCDDA, and all of our research partners. So these are a few examples of some of the straw-infused papers that we get. A lot of them can have a lot of writing on them, or we get a lot of children's drawings. Some of our favorite samples were there in the center there with a Sudoku puzzle. You know, they can do the puzzle and then smoke it. So when we were looking at these, you know, of course, we're always very concerned about how these can harm users, particularly within the prisons. One of the biggest things is that change in mode of use from cigarettes to e-cigarettes was found to increase the number of drug-related and medical emergencies for about a couple of months right after that ban. And a similar thing was found in the English prisons following their smoking ban. One of the biggest things that increases the harms to users is seeing a mixtures of compounds or polydrug use. We do see some purposeful mixtures added. So in 2019, we had seen straws mixed with synthetic cathinones. But right now, we're actually starting to see a lot of straws being mixed with benzodiazepines. And we don't actually know what happens when a benzodiazepine is smoked. So that's something that we're really concerned about at the moment. Another increase to harm is that can be a variation in concentration between batches of paper. So this chart here shows the quantitation of 146 samples that were seized from the Scottish prisons. And it's separated by the different types of straws, as well as you can see the change in concentration between each of those papers. So the range in concentration that we found were less than 0.05 to 1.17 milligrams of scraw per centimeter squared of paper. So that's a pretty significant change in dosing between batches. We do know that prisoners will when they get in a new batch of papers, they'll use another prisoner who maybe couldn't pay his debts or doesn't have enough money to afford it, and they'll give them a little test piece. And if they have good effects, then they will sell it off at a high price. If they have bad effects, like a seizure, then they'll sell it off at a low price. So they are aware that there is this variation in concentration. However, we also found that there is significant variation in concentration across single sheets of paper. So we had taken two different samples. This is just one of them, where we took an entire sheet of paper and then mapped it across the entire sheet for the concentration. And we found a 5 times concentration variation. So this means essentially that from one centimeter squared piece, so from one dose to the other, they could be getting up to five times more potent piece. They could be 5 times more. So you can see that significantly can increase the harms and the chances of adverse effects within the prisons. We also find that a change in compounds, this is a constantly evolving market, and the change in compounds can have significant effects on the harms to users who often don't even know what exactly they're using. This is all of our work from the last, starting in 2018, where we found 678 samples positive for 1 or more scraws from 556 seizures from 8 of the Scottish prisons. This heat map, if you look at the darker color, means that that was detected more often in that quarter. So over time, there has been that shift in the most common compounds detected. Most importantly, following the 2018 Chinese ban of 5-FMDMB Panaca and AMB Fubinaca, those compounds, those compounds quickly disappeared from the market, and they were replaced by 4-FMDMB Binaca and 5-FMDMB Pica, followed by MDMB-4E and Panaca. Starting in Q1 2020, MDMB-4E and Panaca became our most common detection, and 4-FMDMB Binaca and 5-FMDMB Pica began to disappear. At the beginning of this year or end of last year, MDMB-4E and Panaca has begun to disappear, and it's become replaced by predominantly ADB Butanaca. But we have had some increase in diversity of compounds, where we've had a lot of new detections in the last couple quarters, including ADB Hexanaca, 4F Abutanaca, and most recently 5F35 ABP Fubica, or to make it simpler, we like to call it puppy. When you look at the markets across different countries, so this is from Germany, the United States, Scotland, and Wales, you can see that the most prevalent compounds tend to be quite similar between different jurisdictions, although there are some local variation. So it's important to not just rely on the data that's coming from another country, but to have local intelligence of your own jurisdiction. Some of the biggest differences here are that you can see that Scotland and Wales, which are obviously both within the UK, have a much lower diversity in compounds versus Germany and the United States. And this is largely in part due to the national legislation. With the UK, since the Psychoactive Substances Act was enacted, we essentially have a blanket ban on psychoactive substances. And so that means that really has it's not a driver of market change anymore. Whereas both Germany and the United States still implement analog controls. So there's still a little bit of that cat and mouse game happening between producers and legislators. And so this appears to have increased their diversity in their local markets. We also find that international legislation has an impact on all of the jurisdictions. So that August 2018 Chinese ban of 5-FMDMB Panaca and AMB Fubinaca, after that, we saw those straws quickly disappear from all of the jurisdictions. And then October 2019, the World Health Organization Expert Committee on Drug Dependence indicated that 5-FMDMB Pica and 4-FMDMB Binaca were under review for international control, which later came into force in November 2020. Following this announcement, we had seen an increasing prevalence in MDMB-4E and Panaca, which was likely a preemptive response to this legislation, and it quickly became the most commonly detected straw in all of the jurisdictions. Around that same time, we also started to see an emergence of 4-FMDMB Pica and 5-FEMB Pica, which was likely a preemptive response to that as well. MDMA Forian Panaka is now being considered for international control at both the European and the global level. And it is likely because of that we've started to see that emergence of ADB Butanaka and that increased diversity in the market. To add an extra wrinkle, the Chinese have just implemented analog controls for straws earlier this year, back in July. And this makes it illegal to produce and possess and supply all of the most common straws that we now see on the market. So this could have significant impacts on the straws that we see going forward. We have already started to see some new straw scaffolds emerge because of this legislation. This is 5F35 ABP Fupica, and we've already detected in the Scottish prisons in Q3 2021, and it's also been discussed on drug user forums and vendor sites. This gets around the Chinese legislation by essentially adding a second tail on a nitrogen group that the legislation doesn't cover. There isn't much known about the potency of this compound, but based on what we know of the receptor, the shape of the receptor and the shape of this compound, we don't think it'll probably have very high potency. So we do expect that there will probably be some future substitutions of this going down the line. Another compound that we're on the lookout for is 5F-MDA19, also known now as 5F-bezopoxizid, which we have not detected yet, but it has been discussed on drug user forums and vendor sites, and it has been detected in the United States by NPS Discovery. They've also recently detected a bunch of substitutions of this scaffold as well. And this gets around the Chinese legislation by adding a carbonyl group or a double bonded oxygen, where the legislation only covers for a hydrogen atom, a methyl group, or no atom. So overall, our biggest goal is to help to reduce drug harms within the prisons. And from this work, we know a little bit about what is affecting the drug-related harms, mainly changes in supply, like the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw a decrease in drug-related harms associated with it, although they did begin to rise as the prisoners started to adapt to different supply routes. We also know that changes in mode of use, like from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, can significantly increase or affect harms, as well as the change in compounds and concentrations. From our work, we think it's important to study the market drivers of change so that we can anticipate and adapt quickly to these new changes. We also find that near real-time detection is vital for maintaining the effectiveness of supply reduction measures, as well as to inform users, drug use organizations, and prison staff of these changes, and just have that open line of communication between all of us, because we're all working towards the same goal. So I will pass this on to Rob Ralphs, who will go further into drug harms.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm just going to ask you a few questions from the audience first, Ralph. Sorry about that. Because there's some questions that are very relevant to you, Caitlin, about prison use and so on. And I just wanted to start by asking you, is this an international issue? You know, do you see this in prisons all over?
It is an international issue. They have been detected in the United States prisons. There's been detections in 14 European prisons with more serious use associated in 9 European prisons. It was actually just recently detected in Brazil as well. There was a paper just published. So it pretty much seems that if people look for it, they tend to find it. But some prisons just aren't looking for it just yet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, horrendous. Okay, so William Stewart is asking about, he's interested, and so was I actually, that they're only used in prison. But what about when the ex-offenders come back into the community? Do they carry on using or not?
There was actually a great paper out of England by Grace et al. Last year that found that if they are still being monitored for their drug use, so if they're going into halfway houses or something like that, or probation, where they're still being monitored, then their use can continue on, because there's still that need to try and avoid detection since cannabis can easily be detected and straws are much more difficult. But if there isn't that necessity, then the use generally stops and they switch back to the drugs that they prefer, like cannabis.
Yeah. And I guess if cannabis was available in prison, this would never, or there was a regulated, that was legal, this would never have started, I guess.
That is kind of what a lot of us think, because in general, users say that they prefer cannabis because straws have been said to have a really harsh high, and it's so much more dangerous that people tend to prefer cannabis. So if they were able to use cannabis, they would probably all do that.
And did I imagine it, or can they do this in the Netherlands? Is cannabis allowed in prison? Or did I?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay, so that's and William is also asking about a tisalam. He's saying that that's very prevalent in prison.
Yes, it is. We do have a lot of testing of benzodiazepines, and tisalam is our main benzodiazepine that we detect. We have started to see some new novel benzodiazepines coming in as well, but this is all about straws, which is why I didn't go into that.
Yeah.
But yes, we do have a lot of benzodiazepines as well.
They're very different. So Richard Jones is asking, how different are the different compounds? And he's kind of saying, is the difference similar to the difference between coke and heroin, or are they more similar?
It entirely depends. A lot of the most common, so the ones that were most commonly used, so changing between 5-FMDMB Pinaca to 5-FMDMB Pica, there's not necessarily an appreciable difference. They are really close analogs. There's just one nitrogen difference between the two of them. And so they do have very similar potency and efficacy and binding affinity. But if you're comparing it to some of the earlier straws, with much lower potency, then you do see that much increased potency. So they can be quite different, and there can be quite different effects between different compounds. Some of them, like Qmal 4-CN Pinaca, was found to actually be carcinogenic. And so there can be those differences, and that's why it's important to test each of the compounds individually, and not just assume that they're going to be the same across the entire class of compound.
Yeah. So there are quite a lot of questions that are just general to SCRAS. So maybe we wait for Rob's talk, and then we can do you both answering questions. I'm not seeing many others just about prisons. Let me just check. Yeah, these are all. Oh, right. Here's a good one actually for you, Caitlin. Is there any information on pregnant women in prison using spice?
Not pregnant women in particular. There is data to suggest that women have a much lower use of straws, even in prisons, than men. But I don't know specifically about pregnant women.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Okay, so here's another one. How do you get the drug onto paper?
Yeah, it's so they generally take what is generally a powder, and then they dissolve it in usually either acetone, which would be a nail polish remover, or ethanol, like vodka. And then they just take a piece of paper and they soak it in there, and then they leave it to dry. And we've found, I didn't show it, but we had done the test to show that if you hang it up to dry, all the concentration falls to the bottom, increasing that concentration variation across the sheets of paper, versus if you lay it flat to dry. So we had actually sent out to user groups and everything that you should be to tell them to lay them flat to dry to get a more even concentration across the sheet. But they just soak it.
And James Whitehouse wants to know, are the prisons not photocopying letters and papers instead of just handing them over?
Yeah, they do some of that, but there are cases where they can't do that. There's a lot of legal battles going on right now in terms of, a lot of people think that they shouldn't just stop mail altogether and they should just get everything via email. So there's lots of talk about trying to figure out ways to reduce this. There's also been issues with faking legal mail. The prison staff are legally not able to open anything from attorneys or anything like that. So anything labeled legal mail cannot be opened. And so there has been, have been legal things that say that it's legal mail, but they have been infused with scraws. So there is that problem we're facing as well.
Fascinating. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, so yeah, we'll move on. I can see all the questions, people, so don't panic. You'll get your question answered. But we'll move on to Rob, and then we can do a joint Q&A because that works so nicely. So I will introduce you to Rob now. So Rob Ralphs, and some of you may have met Rob. He's professor in criminology and social policy at Manchester Metropolitan University. He is also co-convener of the Interdisciplinary Substance Use and Associated Behaviours Research Centre. And folks, SUAB, they have a mailing list, so I would get onto that. They do a lot of events. I've been to quite a few of them at Manchester, and I'm guessing quite a lot of those are remote at the moment. That's a fantastic unit. It really is. Brilliant research centre. So Rob has been at this a fair while. He's over 20 years of research experience, going back to 97, spanning heroin, crack, club drugs, chemsex, IPEDs, so that's anabolic steroids, novel psychoactive substances, and youth gangs. So he's really got a broad knowledge of this, folks. Since 2015, he has been conducting a lot of research projects exploring spice use and drug markets in prison and in the homeless community. And he currently leads the annual research project, GM Trends, focused on emerging drug trends and changing drug markets across Greater Manchester. And Rob teaches and has all the other responsibilities of academics as well, folks, so he's really busy. Thank you very much indeed, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Jo. So I'm going to talk for around about 30 minutes. And as Jo mentioned, I've done research, a couple of research projects looking at synthetic cannabinoids in prison. But obviously Caitlin's just covered that in depth, so I'm going to focus more on the other main kind of subpopulation that they associate the use with in the UK, and that's the kind of street-based substance users, kind of in particular kind of homeless, rough sleepers. And when I was first asked to talk about this, it coincided with a paper that's just come out last week, actually, in International Journal of Drug Policy, and that was looking at the impact of the Psychoactive Substances Act, which Caitlin's just mentioned was kind of 2016. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to talk about that and other changes, I think, in the context of, as Caitlin mentioned, what the recent legislative change in China, which is kind of banning the kind of production of all the different kind of scrap analogues. I'm trying to think, what the future might hold in the UK and, in other countries as well. I'm sure there's people on the webinar outside of the UK as well. So just looking at really kind of what can we learn from the past about the future and what might happen. Caitlin's already talked about some of the new developments, things that have been found in the States as well, some of the new analogues. But interesting, when this was first announced, and I think it's, I think it was the end of April, maybe early May, when it was announced that China was going to bring this legislation in, which was going to come into play on the 1st of July. Mike Linnell, whom sort of many people on the call will know, who runs the kind of Greater Manchester Local Drugs Information System, and the Lancashire Local Drugs Information System as well. He kind of produced this just from some notes that he was making about potential ways that what might happen as a result of China announcing this ban. And I'm not going to kind of go through them all in detail. I'll come back to this at the end, because I'd be interested in, so there's lots of people with kind of expertise and views on the call, and I'd be interested in kind of beginning some kind of debate or discussion about what might happen. So interesting thing with this, I think for me, going back to what we had with the Psychoactive Substances Act, is the fact that it was announced a couple of months before it came into play at the end of April, early May. And as I mentioned, I think that's significant. In fact, people had time to, in that 2 or 3 month window to manufacture scras, to order scras, to get them imported from China, to stockpile them, etc. So it'd be interesting to see, maybe we're not at that stage yet where we're going to see the impact of this. And I would kind of suggest maybe that's going to be kind of like early in the new year when we might start to see more of an impact from this legislation. So as I mentioned, I should mention, I'll put them in the chat when I finish, but all the papers I talk about today are kind of open access, and I'll provide the kind of titles and the links to them in the chat when I'm finished, if anybody's interested in reading into them further. So I'm going to talk about, for the next 10 minutes or so, a paper which they just come out recently, but was based on research we conducted in 2017 in Manchester. As you can see there, it's with myself and Paul Gray, who are kind of criminologists, but also a colleague, Oliver Sutcliffe, who kind of runs Mandrake, the Manchester Drugs Analysis and Knowledge Exchange. And I always kind of feel it's like a bit of a fraud when I'm talking about the chemistry side of this, and so I'm glad that Caitlin has kind of added that, as an excellent and really kind of comprehensive overview of SCRAS from the kind of forensic chemistry side of things. I'm not going to talk too much about methodology, but just in case anybody is interested, it was interdisciplinary research, involves a kind of criminology, kind of social science aspect, and interviews with homeless users of SCRAS, as well as kind of stakeholders working in supported accommodation. And the kind of homeless day centres, etc. And over 100 hours of fieldwork observations and hanging around in city centre, and also the kind of the chemical analysis, the GCMS analysis of 69 different samples of SCRAS in Manchester. But I'm going to just go back even further than that for a couple of minutes, because this research was kind of preceded by a piece of research for Manchester City Council, when we're asked to look at what types of MPS were being used in Manchester, who was using them, and what were some of the kind of challenges, and come with recommendations of how to kind of respond to them. And if you notice the date there, January 2016 to June 2016, so this was kind of 5 or 6 months leading up to the introduction of the Psychoactive Substances Act. And already the bill had, it'd been over a year since the bill was discussed, and the original date for bringing in the Psychoactive Substances Act was early April, I think, from memory, something like the 6th of April. And then there was some kind of technical issue where it was pushed back to the end of May. So even when we kind of began the research in the January, you're already getting people talking about stockpiling, warehouses full of synthetic cannabinoids. But if it's, lots of the shops are having closing down sales or buy one get one free offers. So again, going back to China and the fact that they announced a couple of months in advance that this legislation was going to come out. There was plenty of time, based on what happened with this, with the Psychoactive Substances Act. Lots of people were kind of stockpiling these substances ahead of the legislation coming in. So I would kind of suggest that that's probably happened ahead of the Chinese ban as well, that came into force in July. So lots of people reported using from the kind of original research. Again, we're speaking to people who had caseloads, they're quite often talking about 90, 95, 99% of people who are working with were using these substances. Again, when you're speaking to people on the streets, they're saying pretty much everybody they know was using it. I think one of the questions in the chat was, why is this, why do people use it in kind of prison settings or homeless settings? The non-detectability, I mean, we still have that in the homeless community, but to a lesser extent. People were discussing the, do people still use it when they come out of prison? But you're not talking about two distinct populations for me. There's a kind of revolving door, high levels of people leaving prison to no fixed abode, going into hostels, coming out kind of homeless as well. So quite often it's the same population who are in and out of prison for short sentences, and then they're spending time on the streets. So I think there is, certainly in my experience, it's quite often the same people who are using in prison are coming out and they're on the streets. Even if they're not homeless, they're spending the time on the streets in the city centre, what we refer to as kind of street-based populations. So it tends to be the same people in many cases that are using them. And for the same reasons, some of the prison research, User Voice did an excellent piece of research in 9 different prisons in England and Wales, Bird Killer, where they talked about people using to kill time. And we found the same thing in the homeless community, speaking to people who were saying, I've been homeless for 2 years, it feels like 2 months, or, it's the only thing that helps me get to sleep. I'm trying to sleep in a car park. I feel really vulnerable. I have a spliff of spice, and it knocks me out. It's the only thing that does that. Or again, just killing time in the day. So that kind of time killer, and again, seems to, not just kind of lose a few hours in a day, but it seems, quite often that narrative in the prison research and homeless research where people would say, it's made 2 years feel like 2 months, which is great if you're doing a few years in prison. Are you living on the streets as well? So there's that ability, I think, also in the, people using it on the streets, where they might not be getting drug tested the same as they would be in prison. Quite often, if they're in public places, if they're seen drinking alcohol in public spaces, if they're smoking cannabis, quite often generically referred to as skunk due to the kind of potent, distinctive smell, then it's easy for some city centre police to come up to them and smell that. Confiscate alcohol, but there wasn't that clearly identifiable smell if somebody was smoking spice as well. So non-detectability in a different way, but I think the non-detectability is also an important factor as well in kind of street-based users as well. So as mentioned, the main aim of the Psychoactive Substances Act that came out at the end of May was to shut down the shops and websites that were selling what were referred to, so in the UK, as kind of legal highs at that time. So when we did just a kind of screenshot of the report, and again, we talk, you can learn from other countries that had introduced blanket bans. Ireland and Poland had introduced blanket bans several years previous, and that didn't really seem to make a difference. And what we were doing, Manchester is quite a sunny day actually today, but obviously quite often known for its rain and bad weather, rainy city. Quite often, if it was raining and we was doing that kind of outreach in the city centre, we would jump into one of the head shops, the high street shops that were selling legal highs at that time, and we might spend an hour or 2 hours in there and note what people were buying, how much they were paying, etc. And quite often, if we spent an hour or 2 in there and we witnessed, 19, 20 sales, almost all of them would be different types of synthetic cannabinoids. Occasionally you get things like cocaine or Charlie Sheen or Ching, kind of like legal high versions of cocaine. And then again, we went to one of the approved premises for kind of more kind of high risk offenders released from prison. I remember going one time, they literally kind of pulled out a black bin bag and were saying, are these any use to you, from a filing cabinet drawer? I'm saying that this is what we found from doing room searches no, we don't really know what to do with it, and if it's any use to you to test it, then you can have it. And we tested, we counted them, there's like 129 different packages, almost all of them, 124, were different types of synthetic cannabinoids. The rest of them were all cocaine, actually, kind of synthetic cocaine. And again, I think that was interesting about the drug testing. If people were regularly being drug tested, they wanted to use something like cocaine, then cocaine would tend to be the main products that they use. So we kind of predicted that those legal highs that were being used more regularly would kind of transit onto the street market. So we thought, synthetic cannabinoids definitely, and we also kind of predicted things like cocaine as well, but that didn't seem to really have materialized. But also, as I say, I mentioned before, this kind of thing about people were bulk buying, that came up a lot. But people were already talking about, there's rumors that it was laced with heroin, it was laced with crack cocaine. People were saying, it's the reason why it's so addictive is because it's mixed with heroin and crack, or they're talking about bicarbonate soda and all sorts of different things. So one of the things we kind of recommended was, on the follow-up research, we include the forensic analysis and the Mandrake partnership with Greater Manchester Police. My colleague Oliver Sutcliffe and PC Andy Costello from GMP was just starting to develop then. So the subsequent research had the testing element in which the original piece of research didn't. And what we kind of found from that, lots of interesting findings, but I'll just talk about 4 of the key findings really, was the quite immediate integration of synthetic cannabinoids into the existing illicit street market, with the traditional kind of heroin and crack dealers, but also the emergence of a new group of younger, tend to be more kind of aggressive dealers, and a more kind of targeted, aggressive kind of supply practices linked to that. And reports, not immediately, but as I say, really from the end of 2016, especially from around about March 2017, much more kind of variability in the content and the potency, the effects of synthetic cannabinoids. So again, when we're speaking to people on the streets, we're saying, the ban hadn't changed anything. People were still using it in the same amounts. All it changed was people were getting it now from street dealers rather than high street shops. And if anything, people were saying, it's not reduced the availability, it was either equally or even more widely available than it was pre-Act as well. And I say, the obvious one was the traditional kind of street dealers of heroin and crack. Now we're also selling spice, as it's referred to locally, as well. So it just become another drug that they were selling. But say what's particularly interesting was this common reports of young dealers who were being much more aggressive. Talk of people being robbed, especially if they were just buying a £5 bag or £10 bag, not so much. But in particular, if they're buying in bulk, they're buying half an ounce or an ounce, so kind of 14 or 28 grams. Quite often reports are saying they're being followed and having the drugs taken off them as well. Again, those who were claiming benefits in particular, they would get the monthly benefits, and then they would buy an ounce with the intention of selling that into smaller deals and making money to pay for their own drugs. And again, some cases you can see the quote at the bottom there, somebody being stabbed in the tent because they'd bought an ounce with the intention of selling it and making money, but I think probably just ended up smoking it themselves amongst herself and friends, and that led to being stabbed. And again, these weren't really kind of isolated incidents. Increased reports of people being assaulted and stabbed and robbed. So it made it a much more kind of violent marketplace. And in particular, in some of the areas, you could literally see, groups of dealers there. Talks about, if people didn't buy it from the regular dealer, then they're being pepper sprayed. Or again, the quote at the bottom there, a young girl, didn't buy it from the regular dealer, and then she ended up being kind of hospitalised because she bought from from somebody else. So again, much more, obviously you wouldn't get this if somebody went into one shop, a high street shop, and bought it from another one. Obviously you wouldn't get that type of violence involved in the market. So it's really interesting. We talk a lot about prohibition, and if we regulated drugs, even though this was far from a kind of regulated market, but it's almost like the kind of prohibition regulation debate in reverse, where you had some kind of regulation or market where people could purchase it from shops, they knew the different brands, etc., and then it went to kind of prohibited market, which increased the vulnerability and violence. But I'll talk about being more available. So it's quite common for people to say, they'd be woken up in the morning, dealers would, give them a shake and wake them up in the sleeping bag in a doorway somewhere, and lay on spice for them. And then say that we'll come back when you've earned some money through begging or shoplifting, and you can pay that back. So people being approached and targeted. Again, really interesting for me. This never occurred with the heroin and crack market. It just seemed to be something about synthetic cannabinoids where dealers, just seem to operate in a different way. And then in terms of what kind of happened in Manchester, kind of Google Maps view of Manchester there, you can see some of the main shots when we did the first research. There's a place called Nirvana, which was near HMP Manchester, near the prison. And this was particularly popular with the homeless community because we say, unlike some of the shops where it was sold in the packages, usually kind of £10 a gram, this place was allegedly making it on site, a particular brand called Annihilation that they were making there. And because they're making it on site, if somebody only had £3 or £4, they would do them a deal of £3 worth. So it was particularly kind of popular, but it was about a 20-minute walk from the city centre. The other main place people used to go was in the northern quarter in Manchester, a place called Rydler, which was a building of 2 or 3 stories, which had several independent shops in there. And as some of those were selling these substances when they're so-called legal highs, and we used to spend quite a lot of time in there, in particular when it was a rainy afternoon in Manchester. And what we're seeing happen after the introduction of the Act was that market that was quite dispersed across the city centre and the outskirts of the city centre really kind of merged into the Piccadilly Gardens area. I think if you can see there, the top right, the white, the tops of the buses is where there's the main bus station, the metro stops in Piccadilly Gardens, and only a short walk from Manchester Piccadilly train station as well. So quite a popular area with homeless community, beggars, because there's a lot of footfall, people coming in on public transport, people would beg there. So the dealers would target that area because they knew people were begging and they had money, and were literally, you could sit and watch them coming up to homeless people, literally taking money out of the coffee pots and giving them spice as well. And again, some of the interesting things for me that happened that was unique to synthetic cannabinoid market. I've grew up with people who've kind of dealt drugs. I've done a lot of research, as Joe mentioned at the beginning, around drug markets and drug dealers. I've never known people have so many drugs on them as you found with spice. I mean, this was a 16-year-old who was caught with 116 bags of spice. And quite often people who drug deal will have a small amount of drugs on them, and then when they sold them, they'll go and restock when they make a bit of money again. That they'll be working with someone, they'll give them that money. So if they ever do get caught by the police, they're not caught with large amounts of cash, large amount of drugs. This case, I was thinking, is it just naive? Is only 16? Is he a bit naive? A couple of weeks later, this was a male in his 30s. This time 278 wraps of spice and large amounts of cash. And this was something like about 10 o'clock in the morning as well. So you can only kind of, surmise that he probably started the day with something like about 400 bags of spice. And so this kind of gave you the indication of the scale of the local demand and market, that dealers were carrying, these large amounts of packets of snap bags of spice on them. Obviously, do you think they're going to shift that in a day or within hours to actually have that much on them? So I've never seen any other type of substance where dealers would have those kind of large amounts on them. And such was the kind of the extent of kind of open drug dealing markets at that time. You know, you start getting this kind of thing on social media, the Piccadilly Gardens area, and someone doing a mock-up sign there, designated kind of drug dealing area. So again, for me, this is all, you know, as a direct result of the changes with the Psychoactive Substances Act. So just to kind of sum that up, kind of into unintended consequences, the kind of increased risk of harm to homeless users, a much more violent market. Also, you know, some of the homeless outreach teams would say they felt unsafe and were struggling to get volunteers to do outreach in the evening because they thought, you know, they're being watched by drug dealers, and an increased strain on emergency services as well. So this was one day in the March 2017. It's when we really started to see the shift and the impacts of the Psychoactive Substances Act. So we had, you know, almost a kind of around about a 10-month period from the introduction of the Act to seeing these kind of incidents. So 22 people in one day had collapsed in around about the kind of Piccadilly Gardens area in central Manchester. And then this kind of, we had another spate of incidents a few weeks later in this early April as well. You know, and people were talking about, you know, the number of ambulances that were called out there. You know, one of the main homeless day centres was saying that in the previous 6 months they'd seen more ambulances called out to their organisation than they had in the previous 20 years. And I think even the North West ambulance service even talked about, you know, their kind of peak time, as you would expect in any kind of city centre, was, you know, your kind of Friday, Saturday nights, around about midnight to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when the, you know, late night bars start closing and people start coming out onto the streets. And their kind of peak time had actually changed to something like 2 till 4 on a weekday, after people had been kind of begging at lunchtime rush hour. Then purchase the drugs, and then we're kind of collapsing after using them. So it completely changed even the kind of, you know, the peak times for kind of ambulance call outs in the city for a period of time. And again, speaking to some of the city centre police officers, they were saying, you know, that they started up until the September, it was quite a stable product, and then that started to change. So again, you know, they're talking about, you know, about 4 months after the Psychoactive Substances Act, so you started to see a kind of variation in the products as well. And again, you know, speaking to users, even though it seemed to be an unregulated market, people would talk about having the favourites. You know, I quite often would witness people coming into a shop and say, you know, I want green Joker, or I want Happy Joker. And if they didn't have that, then they wouldn't buy anything, because they would go there. You know, they had the particular favourites, and they liked the effects, or they thought something was too strong for them, etc. So, you know, one of the things is when it's gone onto the kind of unregulated market, and I think this is the thing that Caitlin talked about in the prison system. You've got no idea what they're smoking and what strain or what the potency is. So people talked about the potency really varying, you know, and completely different effects. We say, you know, one day you could smoke, and again the tolerance. People were talking about getting up to 30 or 40 joints out of 1 gram, but then there would soon be, you know, talk about smoking 6, 7, 8 grams a day, because it requires a rapid build-up of tolerance. But sometimes we say, you know, I could be smoking it all day with no effect. Another day, I could have a joint, I could have, you know, 2 or 3 drugs, you know, and the next thing I kind of, you know, I wake up and I got a paramedic dealing with me. So I mentioned where the particular kind of incident, which starts out in the local press, then it went national and even international. I think we had, you know, documentaries from like Turkey, Germany, Canada, the Netherlands, from all over, kind of coming to Manchester, looking at the kind of problems we had with spice at that time. And as the headlines show there, 58 incidents in one weekend. And so luckily we'd actually kind of developed the mandrake testing, and that was part of this follow-on research. So we were able to find out more about what was in them. So these were some of the, and I mentioned before about my very kind of basic forensic analysis. So, you get the kind of plant matter, which was typically on there, and then, my colleagues, Oliver and his team, Mandrake, would extract that and run that through the GCMS and produce. I think one of the interesting things for me is not just identifying the kind of qualitative analysis, what types of synthetic cannabinoids, but you can see on the right hand side there, quantifying that as well. And broadly speaking, you can see the things in black there. We tended to find that the concentration was between 1% and 2%, usually hovering around about the 2%. And what we've got in the kind of amber color at the top, that was the case that the quote I mentioned previously when there was something like 22 incidents in one day. The scars that were tested on that day were found to be around about twice the usual weight for the quantitative analysis, around about 4%, 3.9 and 4.5. When we had the 58 incidents in the weekend, you can see there that we had it was in red, the two samples in red, 7 and 8, were around about 10 times the usual strength, around about 18%. I think Oliver was kind of speculated that what's most likely happened there was it was unintentional, that when they've kind of made the synthetic cannabinoids up in that particular batch, they'd got the ratio wrong, and they'd put 10 times the amount they'd planned to put in of the synthetic cannabinoid, and which is why we had that that extreme weekend of kind of 58 incidents. So it's interesting to see not just how the different cannabinoids have changed over time, but it tends to be that when it's round about 2% or below, we don't get those real, what the media refers to as kind of zombie-like Walking Dead cases. It seems to be, the tipping point seems to be when it gets to about 3 or 4%. And obviously in the extreme case we had when it was around about 18%. And again, interesting for me, and Caitlin mentioned this towards the end of her presentation, when we was looking at Fubinaca, which was what we found first, and we're trying to do a little bit of search and what was out there, and we came across these headlines from kind of New York in the July the previous year, and really similar, talking about Walking Dead, talking about zombies, and similar thing, just in a quite small geographical area. A spate of 33 people were, treated, overdosed and taken to hospital. So this was the same Fubinaca. Interesting. So this was identified in the July, and we didn't really identify it in Manchester till the following March, around about 9 months later. So Caitlin there talking about some of the developments already, what's happened as a result of the Chinese legislation. Will we start to see that? Similar to this kind of time lapse, will it take another 6 months or so till we start to see some of that emerging in the UK? And again, some of the warnings there, that was what we did there through the Greater Manchester, Mike Linnell's artwork again through the Greater Manchester Local Drugs Information System. So the analysis that my colleague Oliver conducted there, you can see only a small number, in fact we're looking at it's around about 500 different synthetic cannabinoids that have been detected over the years. You can see only 3 different ones here. This was from the February to the November, and you can see mainly it was Fubinaca and 5-FADB. And you can also see, if you look there, that towards the end of that, the concentration dips significantly below 1%, quite often around about 0.5%, sometimes as low as 0.2 or 0.3. So much lower than the typical kind of 2% that we were seeing to begin with. So a quick kind of summary of the impacts of the act then. It was successful in closing down the head shops, but it's kind of refocused the legal highs discussion. It's hard to think now going back then. It was all about young people and methadone and clubbers and more kind of synthetic caffeinones. I think, it stigmatized the homeless population in particular, but also Manchester, Manchester referred to as Spicechester. Don't know if that's better or worse than Gunchester or Gangchester, or the Rainy City. But yeah, it's certainly kind of stigmatized, I think, Manchester as a city, as well as kind of homeless population in Manchester and other parts of the country as well. But I think, in particular, made vulnerable drug users more vulnerable. And I think what we see in, any legislation so far, going back from banning the original spice in 2008, which was seen to be around about 4 to 10 times more potent than traditional cannabis, to the second generation and things like Black Mamba, which was estimated to be between about 100 to 200 times more potent. Then the third generation, I think Caitlin mentioned, up to about 500 times more potent than cannabis. We talked about the blanket ban, making people more vulnerable. So I think, one of the things we know from history is any kind of prohibition legislation so far to tackle this market has tended to make things worse, and make, in particular, more vulnerable, most vulnerable users more vulnerable. We're seeing that in the prison system as well. And I noticed in the chat people were talking about the impact of this smoke-free prison policy as well. And again, predictable, drug policy experts, quite a few of them involved in drug science. There, Alex Stevens, Rudy Forst and Fiona Measham kind of predicted this in 2015, exactly that, the harms of these markets will continue to be concentrated amongst the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, and more kind of adverse consequences as well. So it's not like it wasn't predicted. Again, it was viewed as potentially being the worst piece of law in Britain. And again, post these events I mentioned in Manchester, experts, I think this might have even been David Nutt, talking about everything we warned you about that would happen with the introduction of the kind of blanket ban in the UK. But just about a couple of minutes, bringing this up quickly up to date from the annual trend survey. So for the last 3 years, we've been doing research on emerging drug trends in Manchester, which has kind of continued the drug testing as well. First of all in Manchester, but this year that's just been expanded across Greater Manchester as well. And one of the interesting things we found now, again, analysis from Mandrake and Oliver and his team, is that we started to see synthetic cannabinoids in vape form. So quite often young people buying things usually from Snapchat, paying £10 for what's been sold to them as THC kind of cannabis vape oil. But these are all samples that have come through the lab and have been tested. You can see some of them are clear, some of them are coloured, but they've all found to contain synthetic cannabinoids, where they're sold as kind of THC as well. Interestingly as well, in terms of what we find in bringing that up to date, again, I think Caitlin mentioned this, the main scras that we found locally in the past year have been Butternacca and Pinnacker, but also interestingly, again, this was a user who was reportedly kind of regularly smoking half an ounce, around about 14 grams a day. It tried a new substance, which he said he had a couple of drugs. It knocked him out. Described it as toxic as fuck, mind-blowing, and actually kind of asked the day centre where he kind of regularly visited, could this be tested? And that was found to be a new scra, ADB hexanaca, which again, I think, Caitlin mentioned, I think this was in March time. At the moment, this is just a one-off one. We only come across it once in Manchester in March, and we've not found it since. But interesting that Caitlin said that's kind of emerging in the Scottish prisons, and again, it's been detected in the USA as well. So, and again, I think interesting for me, what we found in the e-liquid, in all, I think all but one of the cases, it was Fubinaca. So even though Fubinaca, since since the kind of change in legislation in China a couple of years ago, we've not tended to see that in recent years. That's what's been present in quite a few of the vapes that we found that young people have been using, and having kind of being hospitalised or being seen by paramedics in Greater Manchester as well. So again, I say I'll pop in the chat as soon as I finish in a minute. The references for the paper around the new detection of Binaca. So, and again, you know, I think because maybe especially in Manchester, you know, we're seeing that concentration dipping from around about 2% to, you know, around about 0.5%. We don't tend to see those same headlines. We don't tend to see people in those, you know, catatonic or zombie-like states, as the media refers to them. And I think that's because there's not as much being put in there. But that doesn't mean it's not being used. And I think with a pandemic and with the annual surveys in the last year or so that we found is that in fact more people have been using it. So the street-based population, you know, people are saying if it typically, you know, they might be spending 20 to 50 pounds, say, on the heroin use. They've not been able to generate that money because of the, you know, less footfall in city centres. The shops haven't been open. You know, people's that you know, you having cash on them, etc. The nighttime economy being closed. If they did shoplift anything, they would normally go into local bars to sell that on. The bars have been closed. It's not about it's increasingly difficult to generate the type of money they would normally need for the heroin and crack use. So that's pushed them towards cheaper substances, in particular synthetic cannabinoids. But which again is much cheaper, and again going from that £10 a gram that was a few years ago, routinely now people talk about it being £40 for an ounce, so £40 for 28 grams compared to £10 a gram, you know, a few years ago when I first started doing research in this area as well. So I don't think it's really kind of going away. You know, the demand's there for it. So again, kind of coming back to the legislation in China, it'd be really interesting to see, you know, what will happen as a result. And for me, from past experience, what I would say is I think we've not really seen the full impact of that. I think it's going to take, you know, maybe another 6 months or so, based on what we're seeing in the past. Because I mean, for me, you know, there's the stockpiling that would have gone on. When we had that window from the Chinese government announcing the ban to the ban actually kind of coming into force in the July. So I will end it there.
Thank you, Rob. That's such a lot of great work going on. All the testing and all the information that you've gathered about, you know, what is going on. It's absolutely fantastic. People are loving this, Caitlin and Rob. Loads of, I've just been looking at the chat, and I think there are a lot of well-informed people in this audience, people working in various services that are very relevant to this. So there are a fair amount of questions. Oh, thank you.
I've just posted those references in the chat before I forget.
Thank you so much. And somebody asked about the flyer you have, the harm reduction spice flyer, where that's available. I don't know if that will be on the web somewhere.
Yeah, so Michael Linnell, I think many people will know Michael's work. He worked for Lifeline for many years since the meet. Michael Linnell produces those as part of the Greater Manchester Local Drugs Information System, and I'm sure he'd be very happy to share those, and even on his own website they're available from Linnell Communications, as well as those kind of basic information sheets. He has a more kind of usually around about 8-page kind of practitioner guidance on all the new and emerging drugs, you know, things like GBL, as well as, you know, the synthetic cannabinoids. So yeah, if anybody wants to drop me an email, I can put in contact with Mike. I'm sure I'd be really happy to share those.
And I think people are asking about the slides. I think if they contact you guys directly, you know, you might have a slide deck that they can have a look at. Of course, this is all recorded, so you will be able to watch it again, which, you know, I highly recommend doing. Rob, Manchester, was it just Manchester or loads of other UK cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite often used to get asked that question, saying it's only a Manchester thing, and I think, you know, we've seen it, you know, with lots of other, you know, if you look at the heroin outbreaks in the 80s, you know, it's cities like Manchester and Glasgow and Liverpool, you know, drugs don't just emerge all over the UK, all over it at any one time. And I think, yeah, Manchester was one of the first cities to see that. But then I think, you know, with similar things, you know, Sheffield, Nottingham, Birmingham, and so I think, you know, say in Wales. So I think it's certainly emerged in lots of different towns and cities across the UK. I mean, really interested with Caitlin's work, because the first piece of research I did was in a Northwest prison in 2015, and we did a presentation to prison services the following year. And I distinctly remember somebody coming up from a Scottish prison saying, "Oh, if we just don't see this in Scottish prisons, we just don't have any problem with synthetic cannabinoids in the Scottish prison system." And that was 2016. And obviously, that is, we have seen that now with Caitlin and colleagues' work.
It seems like it's a matter of time. I can see people in the chat saying Leeds, Bournemouth, Blackburn, massive problem. And the island of Reunion, Adrian Mayo is saying. So it's an international, well, you showed New York, that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I was seeing, and again, I was in New Zealand a few years talking about the prison research, and they were saying we just don't see it here. And then within 2 years, they're having big problems with the street-based community again. And I think they had a spike in around about 50 deaths in a 12-month period in New Zealand a couple of years ago.
Terrible. So you talked about the price of heroin and the price of scras. And Richard Jones is asking about, do people trade their opioid dependence for dependence on spice, or do they use both?
But a bit of both. I mean, it's the first piece of research we did, it was almost like a wonder drug. It was, people were saying, I've been on heroin for years, or even alcohol, I've never been able to stop using it, and spice is the only thing that's ever got me. They're almost using it to kind of self detox of heroin or other drugs. And then, we went back for the second piece of research, and then all of a sudden, they've got problems with that, and we're saying, it's worse withdrawals than heroin. So, but I think quite interchangeable, so some people, again, if someone was begging, trying to get money, they might not be able to get £20 for heroin, but they've got £3 and they can get, £5, they can get a bag of spice. So again, interchangeable use is what we found. There's some people who wouldn't touch it, some heroin users who were really anti-spice, and vice versa, but quite often people would, depending on availability or how much money they had on a particular day, they would switch between one and the other.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the passage of time, how it makes time go so much faster. You can see why that's appealing. So Caitlin, here's a question for you, also from Richard. Do you have any information about the impact of passive consumption? So he says they've seen workers exposed to rooms full of spice and become very ill themselves. And do you know about best practice guidelines for that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is something that law enforcement and prison staff around the world have kind of been dealing with, and lots of people have said, "Oh, it's all psychological, like it's not possible," but that research hasn't actually been done. I was hoping to do it as part of my PhD to look into both transdermal, so passing through the skin, as well as seeing if there was some secondhand smoke from e-cigarettes. But because of COVID and other things, I was not able to do that work. But we are looking at doing some of that going forward. The scras on their own, because they're very lipophilic, they shouldn't go through the skin, so it shouldn't be contact. However, if it's mixed into with a permeation enhancer, so like alcohol, possibly acetone, could actually facilitate its transmission through the skin, potentially. There's been very little work. There's only 2 papers published on the potential for transdermal, and it was somebody looking at it for pharmaceutical purposes, and it was able to pass through the skin, but it required another substance to help it. In terms of secondhand smoke, in terms of walking into a cell where somebody has recently been smoking something, again, we don't really know what is coming off of e-cigarettes with scras. We don't know what's getting into the air. E-cigarettes, just in general, we have so little information about in terms of what potential there is for secondhand smoke. But it's definitely something we have active plans to look into.
Great. And somebody's asking about naloxone, that they'd heard that naloxone can prevent the overdose or can help.
In my experience, and oftentimes it doesn't. There's some straws can bind to receptors besides the cannabinoid receptors. There are some straws that will bind to other receptors as well. So it's possible that might help with those, but there isn't any evidence to suggest that naloxone will kick it off of a cannabinoid receptor. So at the base, it shouldn't.
No.
And I know from doing some work with the Scottish prisons that there's plenty of cases where it certainly hasn't helped.
Yeah. No, I can't see the pharmacology there. Okay, so I've got Tim is asking you to look into the future and saying after the Chinese laws kick in, what substances will come then? Because you've no way of knowing, really.
But again, I think that's something that I'm particularly interested in, and I think we won't see anything till the new year, but because of that kind of stockpiling. But I think some of the things that Caitlin mentioned there, I can't remember the name of them, and I did see something on Twitter only last night. That new group of Caitlin saying that you don't think they're going to be as potent because historically, whatever the next generation or the next type has tended to be more potent than the previous. But from what you were saying, you don't think that these things that are being identified that get around that legislation may not be as toxic.
Yeah, the ones that have already been detected with the Poxizid and all of those that have recently been detected in the US, as well as the ones that we've detected here in Scotland with the 5F35 AB or puppy, because that's what makes it easier. Yeah, they don't, as far as we can tell, they probably are not as nearly as potent as the ones that are currently on the market. The ones that we currently have that are up to 500 times more potent, they really are almost perfect cannabinoids. Like they've done some analysis with the receptor and they do seem to fit almost perfectly into the receptor. So the chances that these ones that they're having to make to really get around the Chinese legislation, where they're having to add on some more unusual things, is going to reduce their ability to bind and going to reduce that potency. But we are working with partners in Manchester as well as Sweden to look at those new compounds and make just a series of all those compounds to test them in advance to see their potency and efficacy and all of that. So that is something we're looking at.
Do they all come from China, or are they locally produced sprouts? There must be.
As far as we know, most of them are going to be coming from other countries. China, India has had some production as well. Yeah, there really isn't any evidence that there's any significant production happening here locally, besides them bringing it in and then making the papers or the herbal material.
And I think for me, if I was looking ahead as well, and I think, talk about the Scottish prison system and what we're seeing in Manchester, but lots of cities, the increased use of street prescription drugs, benzos, but also kind of pregabalin as well. And I think that's likely to continue to increase. But I think there's always demand for something that's smokable. I mean, and the price of synthetic cannabinoids now is much cheaper than tobacco, of course. So, where other drugs, for me, where other kind of prescription drugs will replace it, I think something to smoke, whether it's cannabis, tobacco, or spice, it's a method of ingestion as well. So
it is, and it's a habit, isn't it? And
well, and we have seen that now that there has been a change into using the infused papers as a smuggling method for not just straws, but now other drugs as well. So particularly benzos. Recently, in the last 6 months, we've seen a huge increase in the number of benzodiazepines that are coming in on greetings cards and papers, whereas before it was pretty much all tablets and powders. So they're starting to use this as a new smuggling route for not just straws, but other drugs as well. We've also seen blotters coming in infused with benzodiazepines and straws as well. We had ADB hexanaca was actually detected on some blotters coming into the prisons. So they're kind of experimenting with using this smuggling method for other drugs and different smuggling methods for straws as well.
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? Once you've adapted or you've got a technology for one product, you're going to try for another drug, aren't you? Yeah. And benzos must respond well to that.
Yeah, because again, any of the new psychoactive substances, because they're so potent, generally you can use such a small amount, and so it can be infused into paper fairly easily. But again, we don't know what happens when you smoke a benzodiazepine. We know that a lot of them they're taking the paper and then putting them into their kettle and making a tislam tea. But if they go to smoke them, like with the ones that are infused with both benzodiazepines and straws, we don't know what happens when you smoke a benzodiazepine. So that's something we were planning on looking into.
They were certainly never designed to be smoked.
No.
Actually, Lydia has put a paper on about spice and naloxone, and I saw somebody mention that it did work for somebody who overdosed on a scra, and maybe mixed with an opioid though. But that's interesting to know, and that's great, that paper. So thank you very much for that, Lydia. That's really, really good to see. Interesting. So Richard is asking about how quickly Mandrake and the police, I guess in Manchester, Rob, can test the samples so they can respond to, so fast.
I think they've fine-tuned it now to, I think there was when the warnings are put up, I think there was 6 people collapsed in Piccadilly and suspected using benzos and spice, and from the moment that happens to getting the drugs through to Mandrake and getting the results, I think it was within 2 hours in that case it was turned around. I mean,
that's
typically,
amazing.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. But when somebody asked about testing kits for scras, like I suppose you've got testing kits for MDMA, and I know they're not perfect, but
Yeah, there have been some, but because most of them will only be able to detect for a couple compounds at a time, and there's over 200 scras that have been detected over time, and because the market is changing so quickly, those sort of like oral tests or anything like that, like we have for cannabis, just don't really seem to be that useful.
yeah.
With the prisons, they're using an ion mobility spectrometer, which is what you would see used in airports when they swab your hands or luggage. For mainly, they're looking for explosives, but we can use them to search for narcotics as well. So they've begun using those, and they were used in England as well to screen the mail and other seized items, and those can be quite successful.
And Richard's asking, actually, this is probably for both of you, but maybe on the paper, is the concentration difference visible to the naked eye?
Generally, no. In some really early on samples, like one that I showed, that was from back in 2019, and so that was obviously visible. But pretty much no, you can't tell if they're infused or not. It just looks like normal paper.
Okay, I think there are a lot of questions, and actually, what's great in the chat, people are answering other people's questions. So they've clearly got a really, really well-informed audience. It's wonderful. I've learned an awful lot. I really have. Anything else? I can't, not seeing anything else. Wait a minute. Tim's asking, is it possible to inform prisoners about variability within a paper as a life-saving harm reduction approach?
Yeah, we are actually working with the Scottish Prison Service as well as drug user groups to come up with kind of a poster or something to put up around the prisons to inform them about this. But we want to do it in a way that's going to actually reduce harms and not have any unexpected side effects, which is why I want to work with experts in communicating these sorts of things to make sure we're doing it in the best way possible. But that is something we have been looking at doing. Yeah.
Brilliant. Such brilliant work, both of you. And this has just been the most fantastic event. I've learned so much. And clearly the audience have learned an awful lot as well. And, loads of questions. Sometimes at these events, we have to keep asking people to post questions. So it's absolutely fantastic. There's just one last question maybe I'll ask. About research on SCRAs in pregnant women and the effect on the fetus. I'm guessing there won't be much on this, but I don't know.
But interesting, I know when we've had these kind of inquiries through the local drugs information system, I keep mentioning Michael Linnell, but that's a type of message which typically we send out through things like Drugs Watch and local drugs information system, and to see if anybody has any experience of working with pregnant women who've used as well. We've had similar questions before about pregnant women and using crack, for example, that have come through the network. So it's certainly again, I can a to-do list for Michael Linnell here, but I'll certainly I'll contact him after the call.
Which is a very long to-do list, I'm guessing. I mean, you can do this work in animals, but it's the translation from animals to people, and what you can do with people then is record, what as much as you can, I suppose, collect some real world data from people.